3 o'clock in the morning, and the Northern Lights were on. And Betty, the Northern Lights were on. Magic. I could see them from my slip at the Apostle Islands Marina, and I knew exactly where I wanted to go. So I eased our boat, the Little Dipper, out of the breakwall and headed north to the very tip of Basswood Island and Honeymoon Rock. I anchored the boat, I slipped into my wetsuit, swam about 100 yards to a flat rock where I could set up a tripod for some long exposure photography, and I started clicking. It was a magical, magical night. It was a magical night. And it still is.
Wow.
I set up my tripod. I started taking 30-second exposures. The Northern Lights were reflecting on the horizon, reflecting off the water, straight up above me. It was incredible. It was like being inside of a diamond. And then I heard it. A grunt and rustle from right behind me at 3 a.m. alone on the biggest lake in the planet in my wetsuit. My first thought was bear. So I very slowly packed up my camera into a waterproof box, slipped back into the water, swam slowly back to my boat, climbed aboard, got my flashlight, turned the beam on, and I shined it back right where I was standing. And right there, where a few seconds ago I was standing, was, welcome everybody, my name is Jeff Rennicke. I am the Executive Director of Friends of the Apostle Islands, and with my co-director Jill Rennicke and our board and our members, we are very proud to be the co-sponsors of tonight's program on the life of Sigurd Olsen. The connection is a wonderful one for a couple of reasons. First of all, Sigurd Olsen was a special consultant to then Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall under the Kennedy administration, when Gaylord Nelson was beginning the process to protect these islands. And Sigurd Olsen was a strong supporter of protecting the Apostle Islands. It's also special to be on the Big Top Chautauqua stage, because I've always believed that if these islands and our lake has a voice, part of that voice is carried along by the singers, musicians, and storytellers of Big Top Chautauqua. So let's give them a hand for doing that. And speaking of storytellers, I'll get back to my story in just a moment, but it's my honor to give you a little update about some of the things that are happening at Friends of the Apostle Islands, and an invitation for you to become part of that voice as well by joining Friends of the Apostle Islands. The Apostle Islands is a place, as many of you know, that people fall in love with. It might be putting your heel down in the singing sands of Julian Bay. It might be riding the wind on a sailboat and stringing the islands together on the white thread of your wake. It might be with your head tilted back, looking at one of our lighthouses, or with your head tilted way back, looking at the Northern Lights and the Milky Way in our incredibly dark skies. But when you do fall in love with this place, as many of you already have, there often comes a desire to give something back, to help. And that's the easiest way to understand the role of Friends of the Apostle Islands. Friends helps people help the park. Now, I could tell you we are the official philanthropic partner of the National Park Service. I could tell you that we are a group of more than 700 paddlers, sailors, boaters, and lighthouse lovers whose mission it is to preserve and protect the cultural and natural heritage of the Apostle Islands. But really what it boils down to is this: Friends helps people help the park. And we do that working on 4 pillars: accessibility, education, service, and stewardship. Most recently, Friends has worked to support the commitment of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore to the belief that I'm sure many of you share, which is our parks belong to all of us. Not just to those who can run a 10-second flat 100-yard dash or leap tall buildings in a single bound. It belongs to everybody, including the 1 in 5 Americans who are challenged with mobility issues every day. Through our Access for All initiative, we recently cut the ribbon on an all-accessible amphitheater out at Stockton Island for Ranger Talks. We helped pay in part for the not quite completed project of a 2.2-mile boardwalk from East Bay on Sand Island to Sand Island Lighthouse. We built an accessible overlook on the dock at Little Sand Bay, so we can climb up, and there's a spotting scope there as well. And with the support of many of you here, we undertook the largest capital campaign that our organization had ever undertaken. Our goal was to raise $325,000. Well, it is my honor tonight to announce that we have done that, and then some. We raised our $350,000 that was matched by a $350,000 grant from the National Park Foundation, and the Centennial Fund of the National Park Service has just announced they will be adding another $175,000. So thanks to you and all these corporate sponsors, we have raised $875,000 for accessibility. But you know, I always think about people like Annie Hickman, who early in this process gave us a testimonial, and I love what she says. Trips like this kept me from giving up when I heard of my progressive neurological disorder. Paddling the Apostle Islands has been life-changing. It shows that I can still do some of the things I love. It's completely restorative, even though I'm a puddle when I am done. I can relate to that. We can't ensure that you won't be a puddle after an adventure in the Apostle Islands, but I think we should do everything we can to ensure that at least everybody has the opportunity to try. To improve the safety of everybody who uses the islands, if you're a boater or a sailor or a kayaker, Friends has partnered with the University of Wisconsin-Madison to deploy a constellation of 5 SOFAR spotting buoys strategically placed in places among the islands. So now, instead of a forecast or a computer model, you can scan the QR code after getting a free sticker or a cling for your boat, and you can get real-time, site-specific wave height, wave direction, the period between the crests, and water temperatures. The right information, right for where you're going, right at your fingertips. That is our Wave Watch program. Friends volunteers tend the gardens out at the Michigan Island Lighthouse. If you've ever had the beach grass at the Raspberry Island Sand Spit or Ironwood or Little Sand Bay tickle your calves, that's because Friends volunteers planted last year 4,447 plugs of beach grass out there. We do things like provide the junior ranger badges. You know, have you raise your right hand and swear to be a junior ranger. We help support Island School to help a whole new generation fall in love with these islands. And like the beauty of these islands, our work does not end when the sun goes down. Friends is working to preserve the treasures of our incredibly dark night skies, some of the darkest skies left in the Midwest, through a program we call our Starry Skies Initiative. And that's an effort to protect the beauty of the full moon sailing across our skies, or the treasure of the Milky Way, or the soul-stirring beauty of Northern Lights. Northern Lights. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, I was out on Honeymoon Rock, photographing the Northern Lights, and I heard that sound. And of course I thought bear, because we have bears on the island. I swam to my boat, got my flashlight, shined it on that rock, and there were two sets of eyes staring back at me. Otters. And there I was in this wetsuit, and they're looking at me like, what in the heck is that? And I laughed about that all the way back to Bayfield after an incredibly stunning night photographing these places. I love these islands deeply, and I hope that you do too. And when you do fall in love with these islands, consider joining us at Friends of the Apostle Islands so we can help you help the park that all of us love. Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear something from Meleesa Johnson from Wisconsin Green Fire.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. On my way up yesterday from Stevens Point, I stopped at Copper Falls State Park. I can cross that one off my list now. Nobody told me there would be that many stairs. The front of my thighs are telling me that today. It's an amazing park, and as I was walking through, and I walked the whole trail, and I read all of the interpretive media. I love interpretive media. I'm one of those weirdos that stops at the sign that says historical marker over here. And my kids used to go, no. So read every one of them, and there was a lot of information about the Conservation Corps and the work the DNR did, the work the individuals did a number of times because floods have gone through and destroyed the infrastructure. A lot of information on the fault that runs through the area, and of course the different kind of rock. Because I noticed, I thought, is that basalt that makes those steps? Darn right, that was basalt. So a lot of information, but you know what? The one thing I didn't see was an acknowledgement that that park sits on traditional lands of the Ojibwe. Humbled by the fact that we get to live in this space that was once theirs. And for that reason, I want us to take a moment to recognize that this very land that we're on right now is the traditional land of the Ojibwe. I'm deeply, deeply appreciative and humbled by that. The Ojibwe stewarded this land for time immemorial, forever. The resources, the water, the vistas, this was their land. At Wisconsin's Green Fire, we are continuing to grow, as any organization and human should, right? But we have a lot to learn. Part of that growth means broadening our science-based approach. Thank you for all of the science that all of you do. But we also now need to include traditional ecological knowledge. That knowledge of our native neighbors. And in that spirit, and with all due humility, and apologies for mispronouncing this with my Anglicanized language, miigwech and cheers. And if I mispronounce that, you can talk to me later. And I will never do it again once I get it right. As with any good event, there's always folks we have to thank, right? So please bear with me. First and foremost, I want to thank Joy and Jim Perry. This was, yeah. Back in, I think it was March, Jim said to me, I want to have an event at Big Top Chautauqua, and Green Fire is going to be a part of it. Hi, Jim. And I went, oh, this is going to be a big event. Jim says, it's okay, it won't be bad. You owe me, Jim. And I like good bourbon, by the way. So, thank you. Without you, that dream, we wouldn't be here right now, and I'm having a blast. So thank you, Jim. I want to recognize Tia Nelson. Tia, I don't know where you are. Raise your hand. Is she still out doing? Oh, she was hot to trot on a couple of things. She's probably having conversations over there. Tia Nelson is one of our ambassadors. We have 6 ambassadors total. Senator Russ Feingold, Dr. Stan Temple, Kathleen Falk, Dr. Tricia McConnell, and Dr. Patty Lowe. We're so grateful for the time and effort that they put into the Wisconsin's Green Fire organization. My team, oh my gosh. I am the luckiest woman in the world to work with the most amazing group of people. And I'm going to name them off, the Wisconsin Green Fire team. Carolyn, Paul, Nancy, Mike isn't here, Ben's not here, Fred, he's hanging around back there, and Jimmy Vanderbrook. And we're welcoming on August 19th, the newest member of our organization, Erica Lemoyne. And Erica comes to us, Erica comes to us from Loon Watch, and she will be our new philanthropy and membership coordinator. So you will be hearing from her. We are incredibly fortunate to have Erica join this team. She comes with a wealth of knowledge and a lot of background, so I can't wait to get working with her. Our work group, co-chairs and chairs. If you are a former or current member of a work group and have worked in a chair capacity, please raise your hands. Yeah. Fred and I tried calculating the number of hours that you folks put into this organization. We came up with a rough estimate, but it's just a rough estimate. Thank you so much for all that you do for this organization. Board members, raise your hand. Board members, yay. I've worked with a lot of boards in my career, and it is just a joy to work with this group. They are amazing. Stewardship Society members, raise your hands. Yes. Your generous giving allows us to do the work of this great organization. Thank you. Green Fire members and supporters. Hands. Woo! Yes! Yes! Keep your hands up. Carolyn needs to take pictures. Yay! Thank you. And I want to thank the team at Big Top, Fat Radish, the meal was amazing, and Big Lake Organics that's doing our food waste composting. My name is Meleesa Johnson, and I have the best job in the whole world. I get to run this wonderful, wonderful organization. Every day I get to work with the smartest, most brilliant, most passionate individuals I've ever met in my life. And they educate me every day on how much I don't know. I am deeply appreciative of that fact. I have learned about the biology of sandhill cranes. I have learned about the nuances of water regulations. I have learned about the nuances of protecting greater prairie chickens. I have learned the difference between an old-growth forest and a mature forest. And it is because of our great experts. The one thing that binds all of you members and all of our 700 other members, all of our donors, Stewardship Society, people who give $5, people who give their time, we are all dedicated to using science and knowledge to drive the policies of this great state so that for now and for my grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren, they will have clean air, clean water, rich biodiversity, and healthy ecosystems. In order to get that done, we have a lot of work ahead of us. We can't do that without you. We can't do it without your support, your time, your energy, your giving. So thank you so much for everything you do for this great organization, for allowing me to have the greatest job in the world, and to make Wisconsin's Green Fire that big, bright beacon of knowledge and education that all the other groups in Wisconsin, whether it's the River Alliance, MEA, Midwest Environmental Advocates, Conservation voters, guess what? They all use our signs. They all use our data. And I was told recently, don't go away, Green Fire. We'd all be lost without you. And I'd be lost without all of you. Thank you so much. Now I get the good pleasure of introducing Fred Clark. Of course, you know him as the former executive director of Wisconsin's Green Fire. I first met Fred, I bet he doesn't remember it, back in Portage, Wisconsin. I think this was about 2009. My solid waste professionals and I were having a recycling conference on what we were going to do with the collapse of some of the markets. Fred was the only legislator who showed up.
Wow. Yeah.
Fred spends his spare time now volunteering for Green Fire and also as an employee. But tonight he's going to spend some time talking about nature-based solutions to climate change because he's been spending a bucket load of time on that. So please help me welcome Fred Clark.
Thanks for that introduction. And I can't believe I'm standing on the stage that Bill Monroe once performed and so many other legends that have been here. So, hi Mom and Dad, glad to be here. I'm going to take a few minutes tonight, and Annie has told me exactly how many minutes I have, and talk a little bit about Wisconsin's Green Fire, but also talk more generally about the topic that we call natural climate solutions, which we've subtitled here, our oldest secret weapon for clean air and resilient communities. And Betty Ferris, God bless you, Betty, has been good enough to run the slides, and I just need to say next, and the slides will come up. Meleesa talked a little bit about Green Fire and our work, but that's our mission, is to inform advanced science-informed analysis and policy solutions to address our greatest conservation challenges. That includes clean water, it includes preservation of biodiversity, it includes elevating and mentoring young people into the conservation fields that so many of our members are involved in. And it includes climate change. And I've been one of many of our members throughout our work groups and throughout the various disciplines represented in Green Fire to look at climate as an existential issue, and the lens that we look at that through is through the lens of conservation. Next slide, please. So, what are we talking about? Most of you have heard the term natural climate solutions. You'll sometimes hear the term nature-based solutions. They're very similar. We're not going to get into definitions too much tonight, but it's essentially what is the role of our lands, our forests, our farmland, our prairies and our wetlands and our waters in both helping mitigate the impacts of climate change as well as responding to the impacts that climate change is throwing at us. And while both of those things are happening, helping assure that our lands and these ecosystems are supporting biodiversity, clean water, and quality of life in both rural and urban communities throughout the state, throughout the country, and throughout the world. Next slide, please. So, I've spent probably since the age of 16 fooling around with trees in one way or another. I worked as an arborist, I worked as a forester, I've been a conservation consultant, I ran a small logging business, I run a sawmill and a wood shop. I served in the state legislature on natural resources committees, and I chaired the assembly committee on forestry. Apparently I can't get away from trees. And in my retirement, I've told my friends that I've spent almost all my life screwing around with trees. It's time to do something different. But the fact of the matter is trees are important. And they're more important now than ever, and we understand more now than ever about why they're important, and I want to talk about that a little bit today. Because after tonight, I really am done. Okay. Next slide, please. So I'm going to throw a few quotes up here, and I won't bother to read them. I hope, can everybody see the slides all right? Okay, good, thank you. But our relationship with nature is one of the most fundamental, essential relationships on this planet. And I will wager that every single person in this tent knows that and lives that. If you don't, we're glad you're here. We are like the Catholic Church. You are welcome to come be part of that movement. But world leaders like the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Pope, for that matter, have made it a point to elevate the importance of our relationship with nature. It's more important now than ever. Next slide, please. So to get a little bit more granular, there's another thought leader in this space, a woman named Catherine Hayhoe, who is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. Catherine has the wonderful attribute of both being a distinguished scientist and a good communicator, who's empathetic, who understands people, who is able to resonate with many different audiences and communicate about the importance of climate change and the challenges that we face. What she stated here in this small quote, and I'm sorry, but if it's cut off, and Andy, I don't know if it's possible to pull that curtain back at all on the right, but we need to do a bunch of things at once with our natural lands. We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We need to build resilience within our natural systems to the impacts that climate change is creating. And we need to build our systems and support them and steward them in a way that are going to support quality of life, biodiversity, clean water, and ultimately human prosperity and well-being. Nobody communicates about that issue better than Catherine. Next slide, please. So ultimately here in the world of climate jargon, we talk about mitigation, which is essentially removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We talk about adaptation, which is essentially how we sort of re-engineer, rebuild, reorient our world in order to prepare ourselves for the impacts of climate change. And we talk about resilience, which is essentially helping assure that our natural ecosystems are prepared and able to respond and hopefully bounce back from the impacts that we're experiencing and seeing. That's the sort of technical language. Next slide, please. But at a different level, we can all think of it as human beings. There's a political lens of climate change. And I hope that every one of you, when you vote on August 12th and when you vote on November 5th, whatever that date is, first Tuesday in November, please pay attention to voting for people who believe in climate change, who understand that it's real, and who know that we need to take action. There's a practical lens, and that is the lens that so many of you are already involved in as natural resource managers, as professionals, as just people who care, the steps we can take at home and in the sphere of influence that each of us has, actions that help advance natural climate resilience and adaptation it's our responsibility. And ultimately, we're talking about personal decisions, both about our lives, our consumption, and about our ability to put positive energy into the world toward a better future with a changing and uncertain climate. Next slide, please. So going back a long time, even to the very beginning of efforts like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if you go look at their reports from the 2000 and the early 2000s, the identification of forests and related ecosystems as key elements in mitigating the impacts of climate change and reducing the net greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. We've understood this conceptually. That's already driven a lot of really good work in this space. Next slide, please. One piece of information that really, I think, catalyzed a lot of movement was in 2017 when the Nature Conservancy and some of their scientists in an extensive collaboration began to really model the potential impact that we could achieve through better forest management, through reforestation, through transformation of agricultural systems, through restoration of grasslands and prairies, through a whole suite of strategies that are being employed now and that we could employ in an accelerated way that would ultimately increase the degree to which our natural systems offset greenhouse gas emissions. And their stunning and I think encouraging and exciting conclusion was, of all the stuff that we need to do to keep the rise in global temperatures below at least 2 degrees centigrade, which is what's identified in the Paris Accords, in which our country is a signatory to that treaty is committed to. Of all the things that we need to do, we can get about a third of that achieved through better management of our natural ecosystems, through natural climate solutions. This was really exciting stuff, and they did this modeling for every state in the country. It's work that the U.S. Climate Alliance and others sort of built off of in helping support states in taking better climate action. There's a lot of that happening right in Wisconsin today. Next slide, please. So, and a lot of what's called for there, this isn't rocket science. This isn't new stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of new techniques and a lot of new science coming to bear, but fundamentally, a lot of what needs to happen is stuff we've known how to do for thousands of years, like plant a freaking tree. And so this is stuff that can and does happen all over the world. And the challenge for everyone who cares about this is to figure out how to remove the bottlenecks, allow this work to happen more effectively, at scale, and appropriately in the places and the ways in which it needs to happen. But exciting developments in this space that has really brought policymakers' attention to natural resource management in a way that we've never had before. That certainly has the Biden administration and representatives in Congress who have passed critical pieces of federal legislation like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that has tremendously revolutionized the extent to which this stuff can happen. Next slide, please. So we have been off to the races. And Wisconsin's Green Fire, along with other conservation groups, was part of helping advise and consult with the Evers administration first years in office to try to set targets, climate-related targets. And one of those targets that we advocated for, we're really excited that the governor has bought into, is a trillion trees pledge. Now, if you did the math, those trillion trees aren't all going in Wisconsin. That's a national pledge. But Governor Evers has signed off on commitments to plant 75 million additional trees in Wisconsin by the year 2030. And it's exciting stuff, and those achievements are being tracked today. Next slide, please. And then some stuff happened. And I'm going to focus on a couple of the sobering, troubling aspects of climate change that are nothing new for all of us. But all of these potential achievements with natural ecosystems and their positive impact on climate change are threatened by the impacts of climate change itself. And just last week, a study came out that evaluated the sort of net carbon emissions in 2023 globally that were influenced by the hottest year recorded on the planet Earth and significant droughts and fires, all of which have a huge impact on release of CO2 emissions and have a future impact on the capacity of lands that are affected to offset emissions in the future. The bad news in that study was that as a result of things like, next slide please, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but if you look up at Canada and you see the different greens and blues and pinks on that map, those are all the extent of areas burned in Canada in 2023. Collectively, that's 46 million acres of fires in Canada that is significantly larger than the entire state of Wisconsin. That was the stuff that was a mild annoyance to us last year as we smelled that smoke and talked about Canadian fires, quote unquote. Well, it's a real deal in Canada, but the impact of those fires was a significant reversal of the greenhouse gas emission capacity of the lungs of our planet. And this is what we're dealing with today, is moving forward and also some significant headwinds. Next slide, please. So that's some global news. But here we are on a beautiful night in Chequamegon Bay with a relatively cool breeze blowing on us off the bay, and life is pretty darn good. And I'm sure all of you are aware that this region, the Great Lakes region, is often identified as a climate haven because we don't have hurricanes and we don't have mega fires. And what else don't we have? We don't have sea level rise. And we don't have insurance companies refusing to write policies because it's too risky to live here. This is a pretty good place. You could be forgiven if you lived here and didn't realize that last Monday, 4 days ago, was the hottest day ever recorded on the planet Earth, which was second only to Sunday the day before. So, next slide, please. So things happen in Wisconsin, though, and in this region. And of course, we're all familiar with the impact of things like floods. Beginning in 2008, folks in Wisconsin began to have wake-up calls with a severe sustained flood event throughout southwestern Wisconsin that did things like empty Lake Delton in the space of an afternoon as a result of a levee breach. And it really messed up the plans of the Tommy Bartlett Ski, Sky, and Air Show, who couldn't water ski on Lake Delton. And believe me, they got on the phone to the governor's office. That lake got rebuilt in a hurry. But that's not always guaranteed to happen. Next slide, please. But since then, as we all know, we've experienced a series of climatic events in this state and region, most prominently characterized by flash flood events that are destructive of infrastructure and property. But next slide, please. But are also highly destructive environmentally, because these are the storm events that take millions of tons of topsoil off our prime agricultural lands and send it into the valleys, down the river to the Gulf of Mexico, along with chemical fertilizers and pesticides and other environmental contaminants. These flood events are devastating, and both the infrastructure that we have today and the conventional practices we have today with land management are not well adapted for the increasing frequency and severity of these impacts. Next slide, please. So one of our major goals with natural climate solutions is to redesign resilient landscapes and resilient systems. And with our waterways, often what that means is needing to completely recreate hydrography, restore stream banks so that they can in fact capture rising floodwaters and find places on the landscape to store that water before it heads downstream. Really important work that we're seeing more of. Next slide. There's another type of impact that we're not immune from, and that is wind events. How many of you remember the 2019 derecho storm that affected large areas of Wisconsin? In fact, affected more than 230,000 acres over the course of 2 days in July 2019. I remember driving between Milwaukee and Madison on Saturday morning and looking at the blackest, darkest sky that I'd ever seen in my life to the north. And in fact, that was the storm that brought a lot of damage through Wood and Portage counties. But the day before, an even larger storm went through Langlade, Nakanto, and Forest counties and laid down hundreds of thousands of acres of both public and private lands, created untold disturbance and damage for private landowners, and completely changed the work plan for public forest managers for years to come. This is the kind of stuff that is both a climate reversal, that huge amounts of carbon is lost as a result of that kind of event, and the future capacity of those lands to offset carbon in the future is also compromised. Next slide, please. Annie, we're going to do it. We got 3 more minutes. Next slide, please. So one of our other charges is to create resilient habitats and to try to manage our ecosystems, whether it's grasslands, prairies, wetlands, forests, in ways that are more diverse and are going to be more capable of responding to the disturbances that we can't even predict today, but that we can expect are coming. Next slide, please. Who would have guessed that London would have experienced its biggest heat wave ever in 2022? Who would have guessed that Vancouver, Canada in 2021 experienced 26 days of temperatures between 100 and 120 degrees? An event throughout the Pacific Northwest where 1,400 people died. Heat's a killer. Heat is in fact the biggest human impact of climate change and the human threat of climate change. And we're not immune to that either here in Wisconsin. Next slide, please. So if we look at information that comes out of the Wisconsin Initiative for Climate Change Impacts, we know that we can expect a significantly larger number of days that are 90 degrees and above in the near future. That's already happening. In fact, the experience is outliving the trend projections by significant amounts. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in urban areas? If you look at places like the city of Milwaukee, those urban heat islands with hard pavement, impervious surfaces are significantly warmer than surrounding areas. And you can see that here on the heat map where, you know how on public radio the person that's reading the weather will always tell you that it's cooler by the lake? Yeah, it's not always cooler by the lake, especially when you're in a large city. And you can see that here in the heat differential between downtown Milwaukee and the surrounding suburbs. Next slide, please. And what you can probably barely see here is a map that's called a tree equity map that's developed by an organization, American Forests, that actually weights the amount of canopy cover in a neighborhood along with other socioeconomic factors to give you a tree index. And what sticks out here is that the pattern in this map almost matches that heat map. And you see communities like Shorewood and Whitefish Bay that are solid green, that have 100% tree index scores, meaning everything's good. And you see a lot of the north side of Milwaukee that have places that have tree canopy cover less than 10%. What does that look like on the ground? Next slide. Well, in places like Wauwatosa, it looks like a pretty darn good place to live. You know, I've been an arborist for years. I had no idea you could have a tree lawn that was 20 feet wide, which is the width of the tree lawn in that community. What does it look like in Milwaukee? Next slide. There are streets in Milwaukee where there is no tree lawn, and trees are pretty tough, but they won't grow on concrete. And that's just an example of what we could call the social justice or environmental inequity that's baked into life in a lot of our urban communities. Next slide. So I want to make that point just to bring home the issue that we can talk about carbon and CO2 and parts per million, but there's a social, environmental equity aspect to all of this, and the impacts are not felt evenly, and the people that create the impacts are generally not the people suffering most as a result of that. And we need to be mindful of that in all of our work, wherever it is. Next slide, please. So, next slide. So I want to talk about hopeful examples. Because nobody gives up. Next slide, please. And around us today, there's really good work going on that many of you are part of already, and if you're not, you know about it. Next slide. So down in southwest Wisconsin, there's an organization called the Savannah Institute. That group is only about 10 years old, but they have already significantly scaled up a model for perennial agriculture using both tree crops and perennial cover to literally model ways to transform agriculture. And what they're achieving there is both a viable business model for farming that works, that's scalable. What they're also doing is modeling the kind of land transformation that we critically need to have if we're going to keep soil on our fields, keep chemicals out of the environment, and ultimately have a resilient landscape that both stores carbon and is ready for the next climate event. Really exciting stuff that Savannah Institute's doing. Next slide, please. And follow it if you can. Here a little bit closer to home. Thank you, Betty. You're rolling now. The Lake Superior Floodplain Management Project. It's been a large collaborative effort between Wisconsin Wetlands Association, Ashland County, the Bad River Tribe, many local townships, Trout Unlimited, and other partners has had a really important work to help communities address the flooding impacts that we're seeing, the fact that our culverts are never big enough, and the fact that we're repeatedly seeing these infrastructure blow out. We need to figure out how to manage water on the landscape. And this project is a perfect example of bringing science to that equation. Just today, the Wetlands Association announced that they were awarded a $1.4 million grant from NOAA to continue this work through NOAA's Climate Resilience Challenge project. So kudos to all those groups. We're going to do it in ink. Next slide, please. Even a little closer to home, and actually, if you wanted to, you could walk there tonight up the stream at the headwaters of Pikes Creek. At Beaver Hollow, there's a wonderful black ash swamp there that unfortunately is an ecosystem at risk because, of course, of the emerald ash borer. But there have been for several years planting trees there to restore that ecosystem. It's exciting, smart, innovative work. It's exactly what we need more of. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to give a big shout out to a group that we've gotten to know and will be getting to know better, the Walnut Way Conservation Corps on the north side of Milwaukee. They have a wonderful program supporting urban agriculture, farms, orchards, youth employment, everything you want to do to help build a more resilient community in a place challenged by every environmental injustice you could name. They're out there doing it, and Wisconsin's Green Fire is going to be working with them next year on a tree equity canopy project. Next slide, please. And there's Meleesa out talking to Cassandra Flagg and other neighbors on one of our recent walkthroughs there. Next. So one of my writers and thought leaders that I have really benefited from is Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I think that this quote really says it all. Every one of us loves the land. It's a relationship that should be a through line in our lives. Ultimately, we haven't loved the land enough, and we all need to do more of it and inspire others to do the same. So, and it happens all over the world. So thank you. There's a survey that you're supposed to say really good things about when you get it. I think there's a paper card. So that's there. Thank you, everyone. As was noted, I'm not going to go through thank yous again. That's been done. We appreciate everyone who's sponsored and supported this event tonight. And we'll go to the last slide. Email me if you want to learn more about the stats or figures behind any of this, fclark@wigreenfire.org or info@wigreenfire.org. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Betty. Go forward and love the land.